We just went through a quick and dirty survey of what it means to be a hunter-gatherer in terms of women and power. And I'll just leave you with the caveat before we move on that there are a variety of hunter-gatherer communities. There's many different ways of being a hunter-gatherer that we really talked about them for a good half hour, and that's it. And there are people who devote their lives to it. But it's time to move on and discuss how female power changes when people leave the hunter-gatherer existence and move into a settled existence. What happens when you complexify life, when you settle down into one place and you dig in, you don't leave that place, and you start to live within four walls? How does life change for a female? Now, when that happens, generally farming is the reason that a woman and her husband and nuclear family have moved into a settled existence. The farming is what enables people to control their calories, their nutrition source, and to stay in one place. That house and farm may work differently in different places. You might be like a homesteader who has a house in the lonely prairie and a farm all around it. Or you may live in a village existence where the farms are outside of village walls and you have to walk some distance to get to the farm area. It can differ from place to place, but farming changes things essentially for a woman. And the reason we had to talk about the hunter existence so long is because I needed you to see what our evolutionary biology was and also our cultural past was for that existence. What's hardwired us for a certain way of thinking and a certain way of being, how that is sometimes consistent with an agricultural settled life and sometimes inconsistent for an agricultural settled life. But really, I want you to see how cultural patterns shift from the hunter-gatherer life to the settled life. Do you have the beating of children in one or the other? Do you have control of the woman in one or the other? I think you're already getting where I'm going with this. So I'm putting an image here for you to see of a farming community and all of the things that might go on in a simple, archaic, early farming existence. And you see the hearth. It might be inside, it might be outside, depending on where you are, what kind of building materials you have. And you see people working in different capacities. Now, in the same way that you have a specialization of labor between males and females in most hunter-gatherer communities where most women gather and most men hunt, there are always going to be gradients. It's always going to be more complicated, as Ernestine Friedel told us with the Native Americans of Southern California in particular. In a farming community, the labor specialization is more strictly divvied up, where for the most part, the men are the ones in control of the scarce resources. In this case, the bringing in of grain. That grain could be rice if you live in East Asia. It could be wheat and barley if you live in the Middle East or Europe. It could be corn if you live in the New World. And the men are the ones bringing that material in. Women are more divorced than ever from the caloric nutrients and the bringing in of scarce resources. A woman might have a garden in front of her home and thus bring in some caloric resources, but it's going to be a much lower percentage compared to the grain that existed before. Now, when you're looking at this image, think of what kinds of things are going to change for the woman as she moves her existence from following the wild resources to settling within four walls and having to deal with all of the demands that a farming life demands. The first problem, the first thing she's going to need to worry about is the demand for labor and the demand for protection. You now have territory you need to protect, and you now have territory that you need to farm. You may own it, you may rent it, but this is something that you're going to need to do. And to do that, you need more people in your nuclear family. And to produce more people in your nuclear family, a woman is going to be encouraged culturally, socially, to have a baby every year. So instead of having a baby every 4 years, she's going to be having a baby every single year. She's going to stop the breastfeeding sooner. There's going to be less of a taboo on her having sex after childbirth. And she's not now going to be able to switch up her partners the way that she did in a hunter-gatherer existence. So really the whole thing hinges on settling down and locking yourself into the notion of private property. Private property is perhaps the biggest game changer for women and power in our entire discussion. Because once you move into a private property system, you want to pass down that property, be it livestock or home or the land itself, down to the next generation of people. And if you're in a hunter-gatherer existence, let's think about it this way hypothetically. Say you're a hunter-gatherer, and let's imagine just what it's like to be that kind of a person. And you're a woman, and you've had a baby with this past partner of yours. He's now 3 years old, and you've fallen out of love with him. He's not as interesting to you anymore, and you've had other sexual partners throughout those 3 years. Anyway, not too many, but you have had some sexual partners, and you're moving on to a different sexual partner. Everybody knows about your different sexual partners. Everybody knows that you had a baby with this one man. Let's even imagine that you had sex with many different men within the weeks that you became pregnant. And it took you a while to figure out whose baby it actually was. And the whole tribe would comment on this with you together as your 3-year-old or 2-year-old, is there in the village. People would say, oh, look, he has his father's ears, or oh, he has his father's eyes, trying to figure out which father amongst the tribesmen this baby could be. Meanwhile, no one's judging you for it. No one's calling you a slut. No one's saying, oh my God, how could you sleep with 3 different men and not know who the father is? That's so shameful and horrible. This is just part of everyday hunter-gatherer life. And then when that child is 4 years old, maybe you've already moved on to another partner, you get pregnant, you have another child with a different father. No problem, no mess, no stress. Everyone knows this father has this child, this father is the other child, and they pay closer attention to those children, but there's no complications socially. Put this into the context in which we live today, or into the context of an archaic, pre-modern agricultural community. And imagine what would happen to a woman who had sex with 3 different men in the same couple of weeks, had some offspring, and on her farm was pregnant, gave birth, and then people are like, oh, whose baby is it? Is it her partner's that she owns the farm with or not? And you can see how private property is making everything so much more strict, so much more controlled, so that if a woman in a farming circumstance did something like that, there would be a punishment doled out to that woman. She needs to have her womb monitored and controlled. There's a variety of ways to do this, and I'll talk about that more in a bit, but it's private property that demands that you control that womb, that you know what goes in it, what comes out of it, and it belongs to this particular partner who owns the land, and the land follows down his patriarchal succession. Even if, in some communities, the land follows down a matriarchal succession, that womb in a farming community is still controlled. It is something that needs to be made scarce and limited to only one partner at a time. And all of that has to do with how that private property is passed down the line. And then you get the creation of all kinds of morality connected to sexuality and partner swapping, all kinds of morality connected to how partners connect at all. The idea of marriage goes part and parcel with private property. The idea of marriage did not exist for hunter-gatherers who are freely switching up their sexual relationships or their love relationships. Once you lock down into a settled existence, you are agreeing as a community, as a human biome, that this is the way it's going to be. I'm going to be locked down with one partner at a time, or if you're a man, maybe you could have more female partners at a time to maximize your production. It's a different thing. We'll talk about that more as well. It's not something that a woman can generally do. And they just need to know what the production of your womb is and to whom it belongs, all connected to the economics of private property. So to make a comparison in a way, if the hunter-gatherer existence of female power connects so much to economy, is the woman able to fish and bring in scarce resources, or is it all whale blubber and she has nothing to do with it and thus has no power, as we saw last week? In the same way, the economy, where the resources are coming in, who's controlling them, and how they work, is also controlling the female power of her body, power over her body, decision-making over her body. Ideas like killing an infant are now brought in as immoral and bad, whereas before it was something that you did for the good of the tribe or the band. Marriage is brought in, all of these controls and strictures. Okay, so private property locks her in to a relationship. It locks the man in too. Technically, he has to follow the same rules of staying within the marriage sexually as she does. But if he's accused of adultery versus her being accused of adultery, I think we'll see as time goes on that the punishment for the man is very different than the punishment for the female. And the man is expected in many ways to leave that relationship where the female cannot. Again, there are many ways of keeping the female within that relationship. So if we look at a list of all of the things that settled communities in an agricultural system create, we see a precipitous drop in female power for a variety of reasons. So we have permanent settlements, we have the hoarding of possessions. All of this brings with it social inequality for the first time. Things change for the woman when you move into a settled existence. Things also change for the man, but his power increases and strengthens. Not all men, let me explain what I mean. The power of the man increases vis-a-vis his partner woman in every case. In the domestic space, he's going to be the one who has the control, who has the power, has the rule. But his power vis-a-vis the larger community could very well be lessened. So in an egalitarian hunter-gatherer society, you could have men who demanded more respect because they're better hunters, because they're an elder and thus have been around longer. Maybe they're a shaman or a magician and so demand respect in that way. But in general, within a hunter-gatherer system, the social power of one man to another is very, very similar. And this is where we get the idea of egalitarian societies, right? As we move into a settled existence, egalitarianism is gone. It is dead. This is not something that's going to be functional anymore. Because now that you're settled and you can hoard wealth, there will be those people who are luckier, smarter, better at hoarding wealth than other people, who are able to push others in their community into a debt bondage kind of system, who are able to make them rent land that they've taken from them because they've helped them out in the time of a bad harvest, or made a trade with them when they were starving because they had bad luck and said, okay, fine, give me half your land, I'll let you still farm it, but you give me the produce of it. That kind of thing happens slowly over time or very quickly in other parts of the world, and you get a social inequality that the world never would have seen amongst hunter-gatherers. You have some men who are very rich, who might have more wives, who certainly have more land and resources, and then a number of other men and women who work underneath that man. You have rich and poor for the first time in human existence. This affects all of the men and women who are now poor. But my point here for what happens to the woman's power when she moves from the hunter-gatherer existence to the farming existence is that whether she's rich or poor, her power vis-a-vis her male partner or her father or her brother will now be lessened a great deal. And now let's go through why that power will be lessened. As we've mentioned, she has an increased pregnancy rate. She needs to populate her farm or populate her family dynasty. Dynasty is a weird word. Maybe she's not a queen. Maybe she's not an important and elite woman. But the more sons you have, the more you strengthen your position as a woman whose progeny is protected, whose land is protected by boys who will grow up into strong young men who can protect your land and protect their mother. You now are needing to produce as many children as you possibly can, and you're also favoring the production of sons for the first time. In a hunter-gatherer community, if you gave birth to a daughter, you gave birth to a daughter. If you gave birth to a son, you gave birth to a son. Yes, this is going to be complicated. Maybe in an Inuit community, you would be happier with the birth of a son versus the Southern California community, where maybe you wouldn't care as much. But now that we moved into the farming existence, and you're passing property down a patriarchal line, you really are interested in the birth of sons. And that's going to give you more social power. Females across the board are seeing their power fall in a very real way. Now, increased pregnancy rate is possible for the farming woman because she has more fat in her diet. This is an interesting thing because hunter-gatherers, they have this rich and varied diet. Everyone's talking about paleo right now or Atkins or whatever. So you take all the carbs out and you have nuts and berries and you have a lot of meat. You don't have as many carbs. You don't have rice. You don't have wheat. You don't have all of those fillers. And in many ways, the hunter-gatherers were much healthier than the people who were living on an agricultural surplus and on grain, beer, gruel, bread, things like that. But what happens when you eat grain in excess, or can eat grain in excess, is it turns to fat. So a woman or a man in an agricultural community, if they're well fed, is going to have a higher fat content than a hunter-gatherer, which is going to help that woman have more children more quickly, to bounce back from a pregnancy nutritionally, to be able to have enough fat on her body to get pregnant again, even if it's after just 11 or 12 months. She'll be able to bounce back faster. We see shorter postpartum sexual taboos. It's a long string of words. All it means is that people will not see it as socially unacceptable for a woman to have sex with her husband 1 month, 2 months, 3 months after she has a baby. In a hunter-gatherer community, in many of them, people found it extraordinarily socially unacceptable, taboo, wrong, disgusting, gross for a woman to have sex with a man maybe even a year after that baby was born. And that may seem unfair or strange or weird, but think about it. If the survival of the tribe depends on women spacing those babies out, then it would make sense that the tribe would respond socially by creating a taboo that stopped baby production too close together. So it's all about living on that knife's edge and trying to keep the entire tribe as safe and healthy and alive as possible. So increased pregnancy, more fat in the diet, shorter postpartum sexual taboos. A woman's using less contraception in an agricultural society versus in a hunter-gatherer society. And you may say, well, they didn't have the pill, they didn't have condoms. No, but they had an intensive herbal lore. One would argue more herbal knowledge in the hunter-gatherer community than they do now in a farming community where they're relying on just a few vegetable species to survive. So less knowledge of those herbs. I will add as a side note that with farming, you get this idea of the female shaman or female medicine woman being like a witch, being bad and wrong. The notion of a witch is really invented at this time too. Lots of things are invented with settled communities and farming. Prostitution is, we'll talk about that in a bit as well. But there's always people in a community that are healers, that know how to use the herbs, that have knowledge about what is possible with the body and how the body might work or not. And in this structured and strictured society, farming community, if a woman continues the herb lore from her ancestors in a hunter-gatherer context, that's now destabilizing to the entire community. She can help a woman have abortion. She can help a woman with birth control. She can help a woman have control over her body. This idea of witchcraft connected to femininity is born at this time. Just an interesting little side note. We certainly have less abortion and infanticide across the board in a farming community. We have an increased rate in infanticide of female babies, however, in a farming community. If your survival depends on having strong young lads to farm your land and strong young lads to protect your land, if you have too many girls, you may end up after the birth of one of those girls killing them. Or your male partner might now take part in killing that female infant so that you can get pregnant again with a male as quickly as possible and not put any of your resources or investment towards the female. Male rates of birth increase in early agricultural societies. More work needs to be done on this, but there may even be some population skewing amongst early farming communities in terms of having more males versus females. It's hard to study in the archaeological record, as I'm sure you can imagine, but this is very much the assumption and something that needs to be checked. We also see a decreased nursing time. If nursing is a main means of stopping childbirth from happening amongst the farming woman, then weaning a child at 11 months or 10 months would be very useful to her to have another child. It is not very useful for the child. It makes the child nutritionally bereft. There's going to be more mortality rates amongst infants in this kind of farming community. So we are going to see more disease, more infant mortality, less nutrition, lower nutrition across the board. Lots of trade-offs as a woman moves from this kind of society, moves from a hunter-gatherer society into this kind of society. Okay, what else do we see for females in power as they move from hunter-gatherer to a farming condition? So we also have increased labor for food production and food storage. Now, imagine that you're a woman in an early farming community and you have to spend hours a day grinding grain, processing grain in some way, be it corn, rice, wheat, or barley. You're now going to be doing repetitive actions, grinding on a grindstone in some capacity. While you're doing that, you're going to have children running around you because you have a number of children under the age of 5 who probably are, you don't have diapers in the ancient world necessarily, so you have to deal with their poo as they're running around. You are going to have increased demands on your time for clothes production. You may even have to spin the fibers and put those fibers on a loom and weave them into fabric yourself. You may then have to sew that fabric into clothing for your family. You may have to process the grains that you've just ground and make them into food. You may have to mend a lot of the clothes that you've woven and sewn because they're so valuable and precious. Every little tear you have to make sure you mend. You may have a sick child whom you've just weaned, and now that they don't have the protection of the mother's milk and all of the defensive antibodies that provides, you have a child with a fever and you're trying to figure out what to do with that. You're cut off from your ancestral connection to the herbal lore, so that child maybe has a better chance of dying. And meanwhile, you are completely told what to do by your male partner because you're bringing in so few resources into the home because all you have is your garden out front, which brings in a couple of carrots and beans. So it's pretty extraordinary, the difference in power from the woman's lot before and the women's lot after. The biggest thing for me is and the trickiest thing when you wonder why people move from a hunter-gatherer existence into a settled existence at all, because everybody's suffering from increased disease and lack of nutrition. Moving from this rich, varied paleo diet, if you will, into this carb-heavy diet based on just a couple of food sources is very difficult for the human body. And if you look at skeletons from hunter-gatherers to early farmers, you can see that nutritional deficiency in the teeth. You can see children who have to go through a hard season and don't grow as much that year. You can see people suffering from rickets, from scurvy, from all kinds of nutritional deficiencies. You can also see an increase in disease. This is the time when you invent things like the plague, intestinal diseases, scourges, epidemics that can wipe out a third of a village. Because instead of leaving all of your poo and detritus and nastiness behind, as a hunter-gatherer would do, dirty the place up and then you're off on your way, you now stay in it. You live in it. You close up one latrine, you dig another. It's always smelly and gross. There's rats around, there's vermin, there's infestation, there's lice, there's bed bugs, the kinds of things that you didn't necessarily have to deal with before. So people are more diseased. They have poorer nutrition. They're having more babies. There's more social strictures and controls. Why in God's name would people even submit to this trade-off? Not to mention all of the social inequality that goes along with it. Why would they move from one to the other? So I want to take a step back and make sure that we don't mythologize the hunter-gatherer existence as this perfect, beautiful, free existence, because it depends. There's a gradient of different kinds of hunter-gatherer existences, and it wasn't always this amazing, beautiful, puppies and rainbows kind of existence. But one thing we do know about the hunter-gatherer existence that was not puppies and rainbows is the constant warfare. If you're moving around from place to place, and there's no land ownership, and you're following the wild resources, your chances of getting into a physical violent conflict with other tribes who also want those wild resources is very high. And warfare amongst hunter-gatherers is of a higher violence in terms of individuals facing one another, and it's of a higher mortality rate. So that hunter-gatherers can lose in a fighting season as much as a third of the males in their population. A third of the males in their population every year. When we think about what settled communities are able to do in terms of warfare, it's intense. We've built strategic defenses. We've built catapults that can go over them. We've built tools that can go under them. We've created all kinds of scary bombs and things with our amazing brains and technology. We've invented the nuclear bomb, which can take out an entire city, an entire region. It is extraordinary what settled communities can create in terms of warfare, but amazingly, it still doesn't compare to what the hunter-gatherers did to one another on a yearly basis with clubs and spears and bows and arrows. So really, that's the main reason for the trade. If you're confused and thinking about why would anyone give up their power, why, if the women were living in an egalitarian community, would they subsume their power and move into a farming community? Why would they make that choice? Really, I think the choice is made to stop losing all of one's people, to stop that heartache, to stop that loss of so many souls every single year, so that when you can move into a more settled, safer existence, people seem to agree, yes, this is something I'm willing to do. This is a trade-off I'm willing to make. But with that trade-off, it's the woman that suffers the most. So many things about the control of her body are assumed by us as moral reality. And it's actually quite recent. These inventions are 10,000 years old at most. In the New World, much, much younger. So let's now look at these social inventions. What have we done to control the female and to understand what it is that we're afraid of, what it is that we need to control to make this work? So I'm showing you here an image of women and one girl who are all wearing burqas. This could be from Pakistan, it could be from Afghanistan. I don't know the source of the photo, but you're showing women wearing a garment that it starts with a cap on top of the head that extends beyond the head itself so that it drapes over the body with no contours of the body really showing. You're kind of your own little mini tent. This is purposefully done so that this woman, when she leaves the home, the four walls of her domestic space, is now invisible in terms of body or beauty to the men around her. She is owned by the one man who can see her without this burqa within the four walls of her domestic space, or to the eyes of her son or her brothers. There are only certain men who are allowed to see this female body. Otherwise, even the body itself now is enclosed. There's all different kinds of veiling around the world. Veiling isn't something that's only associated with being a Muslim and Islam. Veiling in the ancient world was quite prevalent among the ancient Greeks, among the ancient Romans. This idea that you had to shield your face so that another man couldn't claim you, or so that you couldn't make eye contact with another man and thus draw him in. This is something that human beings do quite a bit to try to show their claim over a woman. Now look at the image again, and you see that only some women are dealing with this veiling, and the girl is not. The girl is unmarried. It's when you marry and you enter into this strict partnership of control, that you only have sex with that one man, that your womb belongs to that one man. If you stray beyond it, there will be a punishment. That's when your body and face are claimed and must be controlled and shielded. Before that time, you want to show the body and face. You are, in many parts of the world, very much like a piece of livestock, something that needs to be looked at and examined, seen for the beauty that's there. The girl needs to be examined for how much spirit she has. Is she too rebellious, or does she have the nice downcast eyes? Is she somebody who obeys her parents, or does she fight back a little bit? Does she talk back? All of these things need to be commented upon by an entire agricultural society. This girl needs to be categorized according to her docility, her beauty, her ability to have children. Her body will be analyzed in terms of how many children she might be able to produce. Then once she is put into a marriage system, she is then veiled. Now, this may seem like shocking and horrific to you. Not every agricultural community is like this. But what I'm telling you about veiling isn't even how far people will go. I'll give you more examples about how we control the female, how far we will actually go to make sure that the offspring of her womb belongs to one man and one man alone, that she is economically partnered with. There's many other things that we can do besides veiling. That's just one small detail.